Welcome to this session on Decolonializing Imperialism 2, using Digital Humanities Pedagogy to recover Asian voices in missionary correspondence and in print. I'm Ken Price and I'll be the moderator. And as you've just heard, this session will be recorded. We'll hear two presentations and then we can take questions at the end. Let me mention that you can post questions at any time in the chat. The speakers have provided extensive bios via the ADE program, so it seems best to keep my introductions brief so we can devote time to the substance and the Q&A session. Our first speaker, Catherine D. Harris, is a professor of literature and digital humanities in the Department of English and Comparative Literature, San Jose State University. Her talk today grows out of her previous work on British literary annuals. She's renowned for her work in book history and textual scholarship, and she's also a leader in the teaching of digital humanities. With her co-editors, she has produced an unbook on digital pedagogy in the humanities published by the Modern Language Association. She's been involved in public programming and has taken a leadership role within the state of California in advocating for open educational resources. Our second talk will have three co-authors. Catherine Heil is the digital curation librarian at the College of Wooster in Wooster, Ohio. She holds a master's degree in women's history from Sarah Lawrence College and a Master of Library and Information Science from the University of Denver. Her research lies at the intersection of women's history, community archiving, and digital preservation. She's currently the principal investigator on a CLEAR Digitizing Hidden Special Collections and Archives grant, a project she will discuss in detail during the presentation today. Denise Monbaron, a co-author, is the Special Collections Librarian at the College of Wooster. In 1990, she planned for and developed a Special Collections Department. The current facility opened in fall 1995. In her role as Special Collections Librarian, she's created the collection development policy, mentored an average of 8 to 10 students per semester, and worked with faculty to make the department an important part of the curriculum. Her interests include special collections, rare books and archives, library conservation and preservation, 20th century American and British literature and theater, history of art and music, publication, and the editing of small magazines. Marluce Crabb, the third co-author, recently graduated with a double major in art history and anthropology from the College of Wooster. Her senior thesis focused on the creation of portraits during the Holocaust and how museums display these emotionally charged artworks. She will be attending graduate school this fall at Indiana University, Bloomington, to pursue her master's in both library science and art history while working as a graduate curatorial assistant at the Eskenazi Museum of Art. She's currently a student team member on the CLEAR Digitizing Hidden Special Collections and Archives grant, Letters from Harriet Noyes, Missionaries, and Women's Education in 19th Century China. Kathy?
Hello, everyone.
Good morning or good afternoon for most people. There's two Kathys here, so I'm Catherine Harris, and I'm going first today, and let's just go ahead and start this guy. So I have a Twitter handle as TryProfTry, and you're very welcome to tweet and take photos as we go along. And I'm working on something called Revolution Through Recovery, Bigger Six, and the Bengal Annual. And this is based on a graduate student project. So I'm talking about their work instead of just my work today. Let's see. Okay, here we go. I'm working two screens this morning. And I also want to thank Ken for moderating for us and for the ADE for continuing our online virtual stuff so we can all attend. So during the spring of 2019, 5 graduate students agreed cautiously to an experimental and provocative challenge for MA course in British Romanticism at San Jose State University. So after an opening session explaining the traditions of British Romanticism, sketching a timeline of the Big Six plus Mary Shelley, and the Big Six are Byron, Keats, Shelley, Percy Shelley, the husband, Coleridge, Blake, and Wordsworth. So those are the big six coming out of British Romanticism. I propose that we crowdsource a different kind of syllabus with content that reflected a larger cadre of literary voices. Because we were able to offer only 3 graduate literature courses this semester due to our department financial constraints, and because our MA students are required to sit for an exam but seemingly references or used to reference only canonical literature for all these periods, these students were really hesitant to lose an opportunity to acquire coverage for this historical period. They became more comfortable with annotating a Google Doc of our potential semester's explorations, which is what you see on the screen here. They began to ask questions about the efficacy of the Big Six canon. And this is meeting once a week where we started out and I said, hey, let's screw around. And they went, hey, Harris, this is our lives on the line. Let's not screw around. So we had to really talk about what failure meant and what screwing around meant in order to find the things that they were interested in. Instead of moving historically through the time period, we began to cluster our discussions scheduled around some primary concepts of British Romanticism. So we did the sublime, picturesque, beauty, logic, reason, place and space, and identity. And so we were just looking for those kinds of markers in everything we're going to read. What surfaced from our beginning discussions were anchored in Frankenstein, because most of them knew that topic and were comfortable with it. It's this idea of plastic hybridity. That's what we really came to, plastic hybridity. We inserted The Woman of Color and The History of Mary Prince with 2 novels that aren't typically read in a British Romantics course. And it moved us even further to inquire about the veracity of these primary concepts that we had proposed. Now, as they became more comfortable with annotating a Google Doc, what I asked them to do was also to think about this idea of Bigger Six. And Bigger Six was a movement that was happening on Twitter with the text that you see, and specifically Manu Chander. So we were talking about how do we enter into this conversation beyond those big six? How do we understand the big six, but also move beyond them? And once we started talking about what it meant to hear the voices of the bigger six, they were completely on board. We came up with this research question that you see on your screen here with these primary concepts, and it was a complicated one, and we started out by just circling things that they were interested in. Well, let's talk about this popular literary form. What's a literary form? What is resistance, and how is it articulated through scholarly content as well as the material text itself? What's considered traditional? They took a deep dive into terms like, what do you mean it's a cultural representation of England, or its colonizing effects? And the final one, does it simply perpetuate the forces it aims to resist? We asked this question, and we discovered later on that what we were doing was assuming there was resistance in this literature that was being created in the colonized spaces in the 19th century. That was a really wonderful one because they said, oh, we don't have to look at it from the colonialist point of view. We had several colleagues come in, including to talk about all kinds of forms of hybridity. One of my colleagues in the department who talked on Orientalism, Dr. Revathi Krishnaswamy. Dr. Manu Chander came in to talk to us about what's brown romantics. So at the same time that we were exploring all of these new literary forms that they'd never seen in material objects, they were also exploring.
To ask you, to let you know that your slides aren't showing, so you need to go into presentation mode on the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, hang on a second. Okay, can you see the slides now?
It's better, yeah. Now I'm seeing how does the Indian prose and poetic tradition subsume, not mimic? Yeah, it's not taking the full screen, but it's legible now.
Okay. Never had that happen before. Thanks, Ken, for alerting
Sure,
me.
sure.
I'm running two different screens here so I can see my notes and run the share too. So let me, I'm not watching chat either. So feel free to jump in, Ken, and let me know if you're not seeing the stuff.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so we were sharing, I'll pick back up. So we had several colleagues come in and visit with us and talk about this idea of hybridity. And the students actually ran the class on those days and came up with the questions for these authors. And it was really engaging. It made them nervous to do this, but it also made them the ones who were in charge. And this is also going to lead up to what they're doing for their final project. So the larger question they came up with, how does the Indian prose and poetic tradition subsume, not mimic, the British Empire, both materially and intellectually? And this meant that we weren't looking at the Indian authors who were publishing in a very specific literary form. We weren't looking at them as being victims of colonialism. And that was something new for us to engage with. So they undermined their own understanding of British Romanticism, and they also learned that constructing a digital representation of their research offered an opportunity to understand just how complex the historical record had become because of the literary canon. Now, to record the discovery process, they used Scalar to create a digital project in that final project. They moved from discussions about literary print culture and the print history of colonized India to the infrastructure necessary to deconstruct their understanding of Romantic era concepts. And what you see on the screen is the opening page of what they created in Scalar. And their screwing around actually came to fruition because we layered in. We spent probably about 4 weeks constructing this project, including learning what is it to do a digital humanities project, what is it to be an editor of a digital humanities project that would end up being an analysis.
Just a second, Kathy, since your presentation is dependent upon the slides, forgive me for interrupting, but the scalar, for example, is not showing. In the chat, I'm getting a suggestion that if you click slideshow and then present from current slide, that would work. Others know PowerPoint better than I do, but that's the recommendation. That's now I'm seeing Bengal Annual Literary Keepsake very clearly.
The share keeps going off, so it's not doing the share. Okay.
That's looking good.
Okay, y'all can see that as well. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we started this project, they knew at the beginning of the semester that I was going to ask them to also write a 500-word flash essay because the Keats Shelley Journal had just put out a call for essays that were flash essays about the future of British Romanticism. So they knew they were going to build this digital project. They didn't quite know what was going to go into it. And then they knew that they were going to each condense down their perspectives and point of view about pushing outside the canon and doing a digital project into just 500 words. So that meant that they were going to be messing about a little bit. And then they really got into this idea of screwing around, which is one of the major tenets of digital humanities. Now, what is it they exactly were doing was working on the Bengal Annual, which was published in 1829 for 1830. It was published in Calcutta, and the Literary Annual is a representation of a literary form in England that sold very well starting in 1823. And it was really based on the success of almanacs. And almanacs were primarily published by the Stationers' Company. Now, each literary annual usually was published every year, starting around December. So this one being published in Calcutta by British expats and colonists was supposed to mimic what was going on in England. And it was also going to bring the perspective of the colonizers who were living in Calcutta, the poetry and the prose. So this is an original almanac here that was the original model of the literary annuals. And this is all the stuff that they were studying as we went through the semester. So they had a tall order all semester long. Almanacs also had practical information. It had blank spaces so you could write things in there. It was manuscript use, and all this got rolled into the 1830 Bengal Annual. So the almanac format was really small, but the Bengal Annual was 300 pages and had 49 different authors, and I think upwards of 52 different pieces, as well as 6 woodcut engravings. So it was a little longer than the almanac format itself. So the literary annuals in England were really beautifully bound, and they were meant to be an object that was very decadent and you could own and keep in your household, and you would have the same binding from one to the next. It was red Morocco and it was stamped, gilt edges most of the time. So when they saw this about the literary form and they looked at the Bengal Annual, which was really super thin newspaper print that you could see from one side to the next, it wasn't really a luxury item that was meant to be kept. It wasn't actually as decadently bound, and it definitely wasn't as durable. So they were dealing with how do we handle the history of this 19th century luxury item that sort of gets ported over to Calcutta and the Bengal Annual. And this is an image of the British literary annuals are just being studied a lot more. There are 1823 to 1861. There are over 300 titles published yearly. And you can see from the stats there, it's a lot of different voices available in literary annuals. It's kind of similar to newspapers and magazines at this time that really gave voice to alternatives beyond the big six. So we really were entering in big six. It wasn't just the content, it was who was speaking, who was publishing. And here you get a shot of the beauty and the decadence of the London annuals themselves. And there was always some sort of inscription page so that you could send it as a gift to somebody else. And these are the engravings, and they were pretty beautifully done steel plate engravings. And you can see just how detailed they are here. The only one that would be a woodcut engraving is the one over to the side on the left-hand side of your screen called June, but you can still see how beautifully detailed it is. So the London annuals themselves took this point of view of the fact of the idea that India was exotic and natural, but also violent. And these are all steel plate engravings that were published in the London annuals. We also have this erotic and exotic Orientalism in these steel plate engravings, typically of women as the focus of beauty here, but never ownership. But with the Calcutta Bengal Annual, we get 350 pages, 7 woodcut engravings, and woodcut engravings are not as detailed necessarily. And the idea, David Lester Richardson writes in the preface that he had to use what he called, quote, local talent, and it wasn't as good as the engravings he could have found in London. So he was denigrating already in the preface what he was finding for artistic talent in Calcutta and India in general, but they're going to smash that. These are the only engravings that come out of the Bengal Annual for 1830. They're really more of places. There's only 2, the one in the upper left and the one in the lower right, where you see actual people, but you're not really getting the landscape and the detail that you see in the London annuals. So the students started doing all of this work, and they started asking themselves these kinds of questions about the literary content as well as the visual content. How do we assess this? How do we put it together? What are we trying to say so that it's not just show and tell? The Internet Archive already has a full text of the Bengal Annual for 1830, so they didn't need to digitize it itself. It wasn't that kind of project. They really wanted to turn towards analysis. So Scalar has plugins for hypothesis, which is a social annotation tool. They use Voyant tools to explore patterns in the literary works. And we also use Google Books, and then also compared the Google Books version and the Internet Archive version of the Bengal Annual to each other. What was missing? We got a thumb, I think, in the Google Books version where somebody digitized their thumb. Scalar this is the first time that Scalar has been free and open source for authoring. We use that instead of Omeka because Omeka is really much more an exhibit for showing. And we really wanted to push further than just showing. So this is one of the things that's a built-in tool for Scalar. They started linking the pages, and in linking the pages, they started to show the relationship between their analysis and what they were finding in the literary content. For instance, in red, you'll see nature is one of the ones that they start pulling out in terms of the relationship to the literary text, Orientalism, picturesque, and then they also have engravings and very specific literary texts that they looked at to do an analysis. So the page linkings that they did and the tagging they did in Scalar starts to reflect the linking that they were doing among the literary texts in the Bengal Annual itself. They also put up a page called Our Process and Research Challenges. And now this is where they get into being really good editors without knowing it, and digital humanists. They looked at this article called Published Yet Never Done, and they really embraced the idea that they didn't have to have this huge completed version of the project by the end of the semester, because we were only doing the digital aspect for 4 weeks, and we had had 8 weeks before that to explore how are we going to bust outside of the big 6 and do the bigger 6. They kept that running list of research questions with the idea that I would then teach an undergraduate class in fall 2019, and then those students would be able to pick up exactly where they left off. They left detailed notes about the stages that needed to be completed that I could then turn into assignments for my undergraduate students. They also figured out how all of these, on your right-hand side of your screen, you'd see the major concepts that they were looking for. So these are all the pages and how they work together. And this is where they really started to see infrastructure. And this is one thing that doesn't happen with editing. You aren't often visualized the workflow and creating infrastructure for an editing project. Working in Scalar allowed them to do this. And then once they visualized it, they could also see where they needed to make more connections in a way that made sense to them in their analysis. So it really engaged and increased their analysis and the depth of it as we moved on. And in the final 2 weeks, it was really amazing because they started asking these other questions that I didn't have answers to, because we needed to do much more larger scale work like computational analysis. And I think that's where it really got exciting for me, and where we were all really a little bit chagrined to move on and in the semester, because they said, we're just getting started now. We need a second semester to really complete the project. So they started just doing basic counting. I said, let's just start an Excel spreadsheet, because they were intimidated by numbers. And they started counting things, pages, how many pages were dedicated to a particular religion. And you can tell this because it says it in the title. It says a tale from the Hindu, a tale from the Persian, the title of the literary work. They also started associating it with gender. And the problem is that not every, there's a lot of anonymous publications in this particular literary annual, as with literary annuals is the tradition. So we found those out, and we created this male versus female spreadsheet, tried to figure out who were the authors and who was getting a voice. We were also going by genre, which they had overlooked originally because their response was, well, it's all just literary writing. Well, literary annuals are primarily filled with poetry until we get to about 1829, when the short story gains a lot of prominence through publishing in newspapers, magazines, and literary annuals. In fact, Mary Shelley breaks her chops on learns her chops about what it is to create a short story by publishing in literary annuals in London. So here we see that they're following along the trends of what is considered popular in the London literary annuals and porting it over to the Bengal literary annual. Now, India at this time has a really great tradition of narrative writing, and it's been around for centuries. But when the British get there, as in about 1780, they're proposing that they brought the novel and the narrative structure with them. That just isn't true, as we've seen from a lot of work that's being done on print culture. Preeti Joshi has done a lot of work on this on the novel as well. Pages and race, British and Indian. So the thing is that we had a lot of conversations about what is British. Is it a race? And how is Indian a race versus British? So we have geopolitical boundaries that were at war here, and they really didn't want to put this chart up, but they also wanted to see, after Richardson denigrates local talent, meaning the Indian authors and engravers in the preface, they asked the question of why are there Indian authors then allowed to be in with poetry and short stories with this literary annual. And it closes out with a Greek poem that's translated into Hindu, and it's not translated back into English. So the entire literary annual, the Bengal Annual, ends with something in Hindu that's not translated for anybody else in English. So it's a bit of a conundrum to do that, but we had some responses to that and answered that. So the next thing that they did was really assess, well, what can we make some grand plans about comparing the Bengal Annual to all of the writings of the Big Six? And then it became comparison of the Bengal Annual writings to all 3,000 British literary annuals, which, by the way, are not digitized. So they thought that's a bummer, because they really wanted to see if the concepts come through and who controls them. What they found here, at the bottom, that's their writings, the representation of he versus her, and what her has possession of versus he has possession of, and this idea of beauty and body parts, whereas the references to he actually has references to possessions of career, contributions, and country. They wouldn't have known that unless they started screwing around a little bit more with computation, and they went over to use Voyant and Tabor tools in order to do this, because they had a cleaned up version of the Bengal Annual that they could insert right into Tabor and Voyant tools. So I just want to conclude by saying at the end of the semester, they wrote up something for me. And they specifically say that what they found is that the study of Bigger Six allows for more prolific, nuanced, and complex understandings of their own 21st century lives, especially because a great many of them, or 4 out of 5 of them, are already grade school, middle school, and high school teachers in the San Jose and Silicon Valley area. They didn't realize that they could teach beyond the Big Six in their literature courses. They won't be teaching a woman of color or the woman of color because they felt that it has a lot to do with slavery. There's rape in there. There's also representations of enslaved women and the way that they're portrayed that might be difficult for middle schoolers to take. They understood the concept to branch out. And now they could also encourage their students to look online because they were just going to adapt the assignments that I gave them. So, and we did have, all of these students are not necessarily the next generation of doctoral candidates or college professors. Instead, they're teachers, or they work in positions that aren't humanities driven. But isn't that what we want? To have students who see the direct correlation between interrogations about global romanticism and our 21st century world. These 5 students offer such a voice to continue the conversations outside of the confines of academia. And also our Scalar version is available online, or their Scalar version is available online always and enduring, so that we can build on it and they can go back and take a look at it. So we'll be taking questions after the second person goes, but I do encourage you to tweet under DocEdit21 hashtag. I'm going to watch Twitter while I watch the other presentations. So thank you.
Very good. All right, Katie, I think you're delivering or beginning the talk for your group.
That's right. Thank you. I'm just going to start to share my screen here. And if for any reason you can't see all of the slide, just let me know, but hopefully this will work. Okay, so we'll just jump right in. My name is Katie Heil. Ken already gave really wonderful introduction, so I'll be very brief. I'm a digital curation librarian at the College of Worcester. This is Marluce.
And I'm a recent graduate, and I've been on the team for 2.5 years.
And I'm Denise Monbear, and I'm the Special Collections Librarian.
And of course, we have a much larger team that couldn't be with us today at the conference. The large majority of these people who have helped make this project that we're going to discuss a reality are all students, or were students at the time. Many have graduated. And they all played really diverse roles in the project, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we proceed.
Okay, so I'm going to start off with a little bit of background about our collection and about the history of the collection and how the print collection preceded the digital collection aspect. The print collection, we received 2 boxes of Noyes family letters in 1995 to 1996. This was one of the very first collections that I had the opportunity to receive as a part of a new special collections department. It was the first year that we opened. And the letters were basically the materials that were used by Henry H. Noyes to write his memoir about his life growing up in a family of missionaries. The kinds of materials in this collection included his grandfather's letters, Henry Barnum Noyes, his great aunt's letters, Harriet Noyes, and also his great aunt's Martha Noyes, who's also known as Mattie Noyes. Several of the materials also included Bibles, diaries from his great aunt Clara and his great aunt Mary, but mainly we're going to focus on letters today, and that's where the large and bulk of the materials. The reason why I decided to accept this collection, it seemed a little bit strange at first that he came to the College of Worcester to say, do you want these? But it really makes a lot of sense because it is an important addition to our missionary collection. The College of Worcester was originally the University of Worcester, and we were founded by the Presbyterian Church in 1866. The first female graduate of the College of Worcester was Emily Noyes, who happened to be an ancestor of Henry Noyes as well. And from the time that we opened our doors in 1870 up through the mid-1920s, then the 20th century, the Noyes family had quite a legacy of students here at the College of Worcester. So we wanted to make sure that this was one of those collections that really just spoke to what our early students were, what our audience was, and a little bit more about our community. So the next thing that we did was to really talk about how we might make use of these. And as we were opening up the department, even at the second semester, it got right off the bat, we got use for the classroom and independent scholars. We had a student who did their independent study, which is the capstone project here at the College of Worcester, on the letters themselves. And by 1996-97, we tried to figure out how we could produce a seminar with the history department. And Madonna Hedinger, who's a professor in that department, and I wanted to start a course called Historical Methodology, where students would be introduced to using archival collections. And these letters just happened to be one of the first things that I thought of. And it was the first time that we started to use them with a course in which students who really had not had any exposure to using special collections. So some of the skills that we built into a semester-long project tied to the letters in this collection were the use and handling of archival materials, the use of primary source materials as the foundation for building a research question, which most students had never done before. Also a familiarity with learning how to use 19th century handwriting, language, historical documentation, and communication as through letter writing and epistolary research methodology. We also wanted the students to have to dig into secondary materials to understand missionary culture, Chinese culture, and historical events that surrounded the collection. Out of that first class, what we got in 1990, in 1998 is one of the students who took that course actually used the letters as the basis of his senior independent project, which was Echoing America, the Missionary Recreation of America in China. And over the past 20 years, this collection has been used in various classroom settings to highlight Worcester's missionary connections, to explore a 19th century understanding of the Asian other, as highlighted in the letters that document interactions between cultures and social classes in various settings, from the domestic to the educational to medical and political spheres. We've used these letters in the first year seminar program, in the Religion East and West course, which, as Catherine, who had just presented, reminded me a lot of what we do in that course, which we have a lot of those gift collection and those gift books that look at East and West through and authors. And we actually use those and use the letters in combination for that particular course. So there's some overlaps with what you saw in the previous presentation. We also use it for anthropology and sociology and women's gender and sexuality studies. Outside scholars have come to our facility to make use of our collection, but it is because of our students and our student ownership of this project, which Catherine, if you could, Katie, if you can, yes. So student work in special collections, it's because of our students who have taken interest in these letters. I work usually 8 to 10, sometimes as much as 14 students per semester have been working in our departments as student employees. One of our students in 2014, Nate Weaver, was a great interest in this collection, and he proposed that we start processing and wanted to make this more accessible for the outside world. So he came up with this idea of what we needed to do in terms of sorting and humidification and reading, what kinds of research needed to be done, and what kind of what the final access tool would look like, and inventory, and how we would process that. And so what we have is student ownership, and the evolution of this ownership is that each student would review the materials, and the students working with the project towards the end of their senior year, you would usually begin to train another student to help take over the project. And with each new student, the lens through which the letters would be viewed would be a little bit different. And Katie, if you could just advance, yes. So we had students who became so interested in the project. Each lens that the letters took on, how they were looked at, was really based on the student that was involved. We had students whose background were Chinese studies, anthropology, women's gender and sexuality studies, history, religion, and English. And every student that took on some ownership for this project helped us better understand what it is and how we could make use of it, and how we could reach out to others to make it as a support for our curriculum and for outside scholars. The students involved in this project have given many lectures, they've installed exhibits, and from 2014 up through the current year, Zoe Johnson is currently still working with the print project part of this. And we're hoping that the print project part of it will be completed when she graduates in spring of 2022. There will be an exhibit that she is planning, her own exhibit tied to her work with the collection, which will happen in October of this year. But it's really because of the students that we are able to make this more available to outside scholars. My students did a great job with the humidification, and when we received the clear grant to make these materials ready to be digitized, and we could talk a little bit more in the questions if you have anything about the work that they've done. But all of the students who have worked with the project, you could see here their background, that a lot of them have gone on, and it's because of the project they chose careers in library science, museum studies, preservation, archival studies, and digital humanities. So I'm going to turn it over to Katie, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the CLEAR project and the digitization of the print letters.
So in 2018, we received a CLEAR Hidden Collections grant that enabled us to digitize the collection. We wrote the grant to maximize student involvement in the project. The College of Worcester is a small 4-year teaching-focused liberal arts school, for some context. And we in the libraries really see students' employment to be an integral part of their learning while at the college. I don't think that in 2018, when we started this, we really fully understood at the time the extent to which students would actually drive the project and the degree to which they would become invested in it. I acted as a project manager for the grant. Denise and I worked collaboratively to ensure that the students in digital collections had access to the physical materials at important intervals. Denise also cross-trained digital collection student employees and special collections to make sure that they knew how to properly handle the materials. Crucially, the vast majority of the work to build the collection was done by students. So in digital collections, that meant scanning, image editing, quality control, saving multiple versions of each file, and creating administrative metadata throughout the digitization process. They also had the really wonderful opportunity to train with Heather Wolf, who's curator of manuscripts and archivist at the Folger Shakespeare Library. It was just a short 1-hour virtual training, but I think it was really impactful and inspiring for the students in particular. And they followed that training with a summer of transcription. So they transcribed everything in the collection. Uploading the items, they also uploaded the items and their transcriptions into our Omeka installation. They created detailed Dublin Core metadata for each item. They curated the items into collections and built more temporary value-added components to provide multiple entry points into the collection, including a timeline, a family tree, some themed exhibits, and tags. Translation of the transcriptions and metadata into Mandarin is currently being completed by a bilingual student from Worcester who is working over the summer with a bilingual PhD candidate from Ohio State. The only portion of the project that was really handled directly by a librarian was the digital preservation, so saving of the files and the metadata in DuraCloud, which is what we use for digital preservation. And I did have my students observe this process, and I explained why it was important and the actions being taken on the files and all of that. So some students, like Marluz, who's with us today, worked all the way through the project, from the initial scanning through to the creation of exhibits, and some worked only on one portion. So after their initial training, students worked with very little intervention. They worked collaboratively using Basecamp, which is an online project management tool, as a way to communicate with one another about the details of the project when they weren't working together in the same space. So it really came in handy during the COVID period in particular. I employ what I call a tiered mentorship model, wherein I ask students to consult their notes and their peers, and then me in that order when they have questions. And students who had been working on the project for some time truly were the experts, especially when it came to the content, and were much better able to answer questions related to the content of the collection than I was. So the project team had weekly meetings wherein they would report out on their individual accomplishments for the week and touch base about any irregularities or ideas that they had. And importantly, I think speaking their weekly accomplishments out loud probably helped them feel less like they were working in a silo and more like they were each contributing their own unique expertise to an essential piece of a larger puzzle. And it also helped them develop a vocabulary for what we were doing, which I've seen translate into their graduate school and employment applications. I think there's a question of whether it's really a good idea to have undergraduate students do this work, so I want to address that question. Many grants such as these are written with the perfection of the final collection as kind of the primary goal. And along with the time constraint that many departments face, I think that drives many decisions about how best to execute various tasks along the way. And I think we could have easily chosen to apply to have the letters digitized, transcribed, and translated externally. Many people do. And I think that may have led to a more polished collection in the end, but there's also something to be said for having the same people that transcribe the letters be the people who are creating the descriptive metadata for a collection. That kind of time spent with the materials necessarily translates into better metadata that preserves the relationship between related objects and ongoing stories and relationships better than if separate entities do that work. So I think given the impact of the work on students who did it, it would have also been a really a loss for them if we had decided to outsource a lot of that work.
Okay, so I joined this project under the suggestion of my friend who was already working in digital collections. As someone who has always been interested in humanities and social sciences, she felt that this project would be a good fit for me. Previously, I had a work study in the local library in the children's department, and while I enjoyed my time there, the position offered me a very narrow view of what it means to be a librarian. My work with the Noyes collection helped expand this definition and introduced me to various avenues for future studies, such as archives and digital humanities / librarianship. Additionally, my work with the Noyes collection has provided me with experiences that other undergraduates do not necessarily have access to. In considering this, it made me wonder about how many students simply do not apply to library school because they aren't aware of all the opportunities under the umbrella of library science. I first started working on the Noyes collection in the second semester of my sophomore year, and I'm concluding my work this summer after graduation. I've scanned various documents for the collection using the flatbed and book scanners. I've transcribed countless documents. I have met with the paleographer from the Folgers Institute, and I've been able to compile my knowledge alongside other students in the curation of the NOMECA website dedicated to the collection. The College of Worcester focuses on experiential learning opportunities. So my work with Katie Heil and digital collections acted as an extension of my in-class work and experiences. The knowledge and tools I acquired throughout my time on this project aided me in my senior thesis, which focused on the creation of portraits during the Holocaust and their display in museums. In the wake of the pandemic, I was unable to visit any of the museums in person that I studied. So archives offered a treasure trove of data I would not have previously thought to ask about. I submitted research requests to various institutions, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, with success. Archives played a key role in shaping my study, but my interaction with various museums also illuminated the importance of digital collections. In a world where there are still numerous socioeconomic barriers to visiting museums, digitization is a step towards accessibility and opening museum collections to the public. In the fall, I will be attending graduate school to work towards my master's in both art history and library science. This decision and opportunity would not have been possible without my work with the Noyes collections. Throughout my time on the project, I have seen myself grow from a sophomore who knew absolutely nothing about digital librarianship to someone who hopes to pursue a career at the intersection of museums, archives, and digital humanities. I find myself returning to the idea of accessibility and longevity, both of which were constant themes throughout my involvement with the Noyes collection. One element of the project that has been particularly influential to me was the process of transcription. I began this project having never transcribed any physical document. I had only ever transcribed oral histories and interviews as an anthropology student interested in ethnography. Transcription has always been equal parts interesting and a frustrating endeavor. I still remember transcribing my very first letter of Harriet's, shown here on the left. She was writing about Dr. Kerr, a medical missionary who would eventually marry her older sister, Martha. I was puzzled by her handwriting and put "da hair" in brackets and question marks, indicating I was making an educated guess. Knowing she was American, I was confused by this potentially German phrase in the middle of her letter. Looking back, I view these letters as legible and easy to read. At the start of her mission work, Harriet is young, diligent, and excited, and because of this, her handwriting is a lot easier to read and is much neater. As she gets older and busier, her handwriting shifts and changes. Additionally, her brother Henry's handwriting, shown on the right in the form of a sermon, is particularly confusing because he seems to employ a sort of pseudo-cursive that is less recognizable than that of his female counterparts. Perhaps this is reading into handwriting too much, but you can almost see the power dynamics at play in his relaxed handwriting versus the careful lines and loops of his sisters. Along the vein of reading too much into handwriting, You can also learn a lot about money and the cost of sending letters from how the Noyes family writes their letters. Maddie and Hattie were practiced in the form of cross-hatching, shown here on the left, which is writing one way on the paper and then flipping it and writing across your previous handwriting. This made it so they did not have to purchase as much paper and reduced the weight of the letters they were sending on steamers from Canton, present-day Guangzhou, China, to Seville, Ohio. Additionally, another difficulty that cropped up was the introduction of new authors, such as the one shown on the right. Although Harriet and her siblings, Martha and Henry, make up the majority of the collection, single authors also show up. With these single examples of their handwriting, it's hard to get familiar with their style and paleographic choices, especially when they have like the blurring of the pen and these intense swoops that go on to their next word as shown on the right, and thus more transcription errors may occur, or more areas may be illegible. Another aspect of this project that was unique and fulfilling was the proximity to one of the locations being discussed in the letters. Sometimes in learning history in the classroom, people, events, and places can feel abstract and far away, but this was not the case for the collection since the Noyes family hailed from Seville, Ohio, a 30-minute drive from the College of Worcester. In the summer of 2019, we took an office field trip to the cemetery where the entire family was buried and are honored, a giant family headstone shown on the slide. Furthermore, Emily Noyes, the younger sister of the Noyes missionary siblings, was the first woman to graduate in 1874, almost 150 years before I graduated from there. This project offered a tangibility to history, and in this way helped me connect to those who wrote the letters. I was able to read their humorous one-liners, such as one of my favorites, "My forehead is getting quite wrinkled, although I don't think it is as bad yet as the old maids out west that they use for a nutmeg grater," and understand how they were just people. But in this realization, I also had to recognize their faults. Although there are numerous letters in the collection that illustrate the Noyes' support of Chinese immigration to the United States and their distaste for imperial powers such as the French and the English, they also fail to see how they too participate in these imperialist structures as missionaries. In one letter, Barnum Noyes, the father of the Noyes missionary siblings, writes, "I do hope the French will get their difficulties settled with the Chinese without war. The French seem of late to have got the annexation fever. They want to annex to their nation a considerable portion of Africa and are disposed to interfere with our missionary operations in that country. I hope the United States will soon see the propriety of repealing the partial once abominable laws they have enacted respecting the Chinese. It is too bad that our nation should have the unenviable singularity of being the only nation upon the face of our globe that prohibits Chinese migration." And that letter is shown on the left. If nothing else, excerpts from the letters, like that one from 1883, show the complexity of these figures and their participation in imperialism and missionary work. The Noyes wanted to help the Chinese, but they viewed that help through a lens of white saviorism and Christianity. This is exemplified in a letter where Harriet employs some feminist thinking alongside derogatory language regarding the Chinese or people who aren't Christian. She says, "I cannot help feeling that it is a specimen of unmitigated selfishness when a man raises his voice to protest against sending out single ladies as though the men only were privileged to work for Christ among the heathens." And that is shown in this letter here. My experiences throughout this project have afforded me the opportunity to witness more nuanced narratives of history through firsthand accounts and secondary research, to compile exhibitions, and has provided me with the tools and knowledge to guide my future studies. Throughout this project, I have continuously confronted my monolithic or singular views on subjects and ideas, whether it be missionary work or the field of library studies.
So the first thing I want to point out about our project design in particular might seem simple, but I think it's important. We take every opportunity to credit students appropriately for their work. So the About page for the project gives a clear description of students' roles in the project and lists all contributors individually. Students' contributions, especially undergrad students, are too often obscured or entirely absent from the public-facing results of projects such as these. Students were also paid through the grant for their work on the project. The first thing that we did to try and counter a singular reading of the collection was to create exhibits, a timeline, a family tree, and tags, which I think helped to foreground the historical context for readers of the collection. This brings into focus the tension between the parts of the collection that we celebrate, some of the tension that Marlise was just discussing, the bravery, the leadership of a young woman in the late 19th century, the focus on the education of girls and employment of women, with the parts of the collection that we identify as problematic. So the occasional racist remarks in the letters, the entire concept of Western missionary work in China at the time, the letter writers' positions as empowered observers of the Chinese, and the corresponding objectification of the Chinese. The extra layer of historical context asks readers to enter the letters through our modern day writing about them, rather than directly through the words of the letters themselves. Perhaps the most important component of the project is the side-by-side display of Mandarin translations alongside the English transcriptions and metadata. This invites readings of the materials by those whose histories they chronicle. There are now 3 branches of the True Light School, formerly the True Light Seminary, and that's the school that Harriet Noyes founded, and it's the setting of most of this correspondence. The school remains a prestigious girls' school. The Chinese translations open the collection to be experienced by all of those invested in the school and the region's histories. And the side-by-side display also functions as a way to say to the Western reader that there are multiple readings of this collection, and ultimately it's not only here for Western readers. So that's kind of a very brief summary of our project, and please reach out. I think we'll go to questions now.
Mute. Thank you for the presentations. Those were great. Sarah Martin has a question for Kathy. She says, "Brava, I love the way the end of your talk focuses on," this is for Kathy Harris, "I love the way the end of your talk focuses on public humanities and K-12 significance. What does this say about the future of recovery practice and analysis? And or, since we both served on the MLA Committee on Scholarly Editions, how should it shape and push our institutional experts, in quotation marks, who give advice on best practices for textual scholarship?"
Thanks. And Ken, I think, didn't you also serve on that committee?
I did indeed.
Before Noelle and I got back there, I took a peek. So that's a question from Noelle Baker, and we both served on the Committee on Scholarly Editing for the MLA, which gives the seal to scholarly editions. So thank you for the question, Noelle. It's a big question, and I think one of the things that we're really looking at is not just in digital humanities or editing, creating more digital humanists or creating more editors, but articulating to people how creating these historical portals gives weight to more voices than for me, in the white male literary canon. And that's what I'm finding most exciting when I'm doing some teaching. And now in the newer position that I'm in, I'm also including community outreach and articulating to them why it's important to record their own voices. And we have things at San Jose State now. We've just started a new project called COVID Voices. And we've asked people to either call in or write in or send us postcards recording what happened to them during the pandemic. And now it's being a study, and it's been archived. And we really reached out to the local San Jose area. So I think we have, there's a balance when we start talking about public history, public humanities, public arts, and really taking a look at who's getting recorded, who's getting voices put in there, and how we can open that up in terms of the curriculum, because I'm still finding very traditional canonical literary curriculum all over the place that I'd like to see busted out and open. So it's little by little, and I think we've been able to sneak it in under the guise of digital pedagogy, like offering people easy to use tools like Scalar, where they can use and then see and visualize big swaths of thing very easily. And I do want to note that my students also were engaged in metadata, though we didn't spend that much time on what is metadata and infrastructure in the class because I think their heads were going to explode. They did understand the value of creating a sustainable project. And one of the things that we're doing, to the second part of your question, Noelle, about how do we push our institutional experts, one committee at a time, and asking them to make changes. I think the current instantiation of this committee is already rewritten how to assess scholarly editing publications in the digital realm, and not necessarily porting print over into digital because it's a very different animal. And Rupika Risam actually did a great job of pointing out for us what needed to be changed for our review process in order to validate or authorize. I also think these micro editions are really something that is going to take off because a lot of people are intimidated by looking at digital editions and saying, I don't have enough money to do the Blake archive. There's not enough money, or the Whitman archive, which Ken, y'all have done such a brilliant job at, but there's so many people out there wanting to do scholarly editing and digital scholarly editing. And now that we have more free tools like Scalar and Omeka and Voyant tools, that they are able to use it not only in their curriculum, but also in their research. So we just need to keep getting the word out. And I think the ADE is going to play a major role in promoting these micro editions, as well as reviews in Digital Humanities is also looking at all of these extra canonical and outside of the literary form, and looking at those DH projects and assessing them based on not porting over the print versions of it, but in fact, looking at new ways that we can look at digital editing itself. And I know Catherine Tomasek is in the audience as well, and she has a lot to say and has done a really brilliant job for decades, or more than a decade, about how to do much more editing at this level and with curriculum too. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, and thank you for noting it was from Noelle. I misspoke when I credited it to Sarah. So not quite understanding initially how the questions were being funneled to me. We do have another question from Mark Ashurst McKee for the other group, and he was hoping that you could describe Dublin Core and explain more about it, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have breezed right over that. So Dublin Core is just a schema for description of archival materials in particular. It's a really common one. So if you think about like a painting on a wall at a museum, there's always a little plaque next to it that has information about who painted it, the materials used, that kind of thing. And this is the same thing, but it's built for a wider variety of materials. So written materials in particular works well for things like correspondence. So it includes title, subjects, description, creator, source, publisher, date, contributor, rights, format, language, type, identifier, and coverage.
Great. I have a follow-up question about the Noyes project. There was mention of transcription. Is the goal to transcribe the entirety of the collection, or is it selective transcription? And if it's selective, what are the grounds for choosing the things that you're choosing?
Marlise, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, so we have the collection that we have digitized is about over like 1,000 materials, and we have transcribed all of them. And there are a few things that we actually haven't digitized. There are a couple of very small diaries that are probably like maybe the size a little bit bigger than one of my sides of my glasses, and so they're incredibly fragile. So in order to not hurt them at all on the scanner, we haven't digitized or transcribed those. But everything else, we have had the time to transcribe them.
Okay, wonderful. We have a question from Noelle Baker for Katie, Denise, and Marlise. She loves that you're bringing the Mandarin translation to this project. What would be some of your hopes for what this translation can achieve?
Well, there are a couple of different reasons for including this really big part of the project in the grant application and in the project plan. One of them is to make the content accessible to the people in the actual local area that's being written about. So we ended up, just because of the association of the Noyes family with the College of Worcester, with this huge collection of materials that mostly has to do with this school in China that still exists. In fact, we worked with the school in China to, they wrote a letter of support for the grant, and we're going to kind of have a big exhibit wherein we share our final work with them. And so it's important to me that work be legible to that group of people in particular, but also everyone in the area, because it's the content of the collection really spans a lot of geographic history, or a lot of geographic area in history. So it talks about, for example, not just the school, but also a hospital. A lot of the women who graduated from the school ended up working at the hospital, and they had a pretty close relationship. So I wanted all of those people to be able to use the collection and review the materials on their own. It was also important to me that Western readers of the collection not see it solely as existing for them, because it doesn't. It's really supposed to be an international project with an international audience, and so I think it does that work as well.
One of the themes of this conference, of course, speaks directly to recovery efforts, and I was recently struck by something I was reading that commented on the importance of the so-called railroad Chinese in the establishment of the Transcontinental Railroad, and the remarkable fact that not a single document supposedly still exists written by those workers in the US or in China. It seems astonishing. And also there are hardly no individual names, even in the records of the railroad companies. So it's really a lost history. I don't suppose there's any reference to anything like that, because I believe it's the same, that most of the workers came from that same part of China that the Noyes family was serving as missionaries in. You didn't see anything about the railroad, even if it was a bit after. When did they arrive in China, by the way? What was the year?
Do you know off the top of your head, Marlies, what that year was?
So Henry arrives in 1867 and Harriet arrives in 1868. They stay until Henry's death, which I can't remember the year, sometime in the 1910s, and then Harriet leaves in 1923.
Huh, because the railroad was, the Golden Spike, I think, is 1869. So interesting, intersection. If you see any references to the railroad in those documents, I think that would be of real interest to a lot of scholars. Just a long shot.
There are some brief mentions of the railroad, but only as the function for them to travel to San Francisco to then get on a boat to China. It's not really, they don't really talk about the politics of the railroad. But if you are interested, on the website, there is a tag called railroad, or you can search the word railroad to get results. I could have missed something.
Excellent. Let's see, do we have any other? I think I've got a question. I don't know who it's from, but let me see if I'm sorry. So Noel Baker is asking both groups, both presentations, what are some of your most rewarding takeaways about digital pedagogy and recovery?
I can jump on this one. I think the reward is about, in a 16-week semester, about 10 weeks in, you see the light bulb go off for students, for both grad and undergrad, where they realize that, number one, the methods that we're using are okay, and it's not as much of a risk as they thought before. And number two, just how much more depth they can get from use of the digital pedagogy and digital humanities methods, and moving away from doing case studies where they're reading Dickens and extrapolating Dickens' use of the novel for everybody in the 19th century. And then understanding that gives them a greater sense of not only what was happening, but they also get a greater sense of belonging. Most of my students are students of color, and their response is they see themselves reflected in the literary representations that we're looking at rather than not being. And that has been a huge impact on our department and our curriculum as well, as they start to see themselves in the work that we're reading instead of being so distant. And it's changing a lot recently as a Cal State, because we are now over enrolled everywhere, and students are flocking back, and they want to know these new ways to look at things so that they can push boundaries rather than just learn transferable skills in any sort of way. So then they can go change the world in the ways that are beneficial to them. It's just, small things.
I'll jump in. I think similarly, and this doesn't just apply to the students who worked on this project. A lot of the students worked on this project for multiple years, 10 hours a week. So it was a very kind of immersive project. But in general, I think with digital pedagogy, the most rewarding thing for me is to see students' confidence that they gain. So a lot of people start, especially if it's a class assignment or something, with this idea that, well, I'm not a computer person. I don't really have anything to offer, right? I can't do this work. And then I think they start to own their own expertise, whatever that is. And it's likely not computers, even by the end of a class or by the end of multiple classes. But it's still incredibly valuable to the project. And they see that, I think, by the end. And that's really rewarding. And then, of course, with longer term students that feel inspired by the content that they're working with, or by the teamwork, that really enjoy the work, and then go on to pursue work in that area, I think is also really rewarding.
And just to dovetail on that too, certainly there's the Noyes collection, but I also work with a group of faculty in the history department here, and students who have been, that grew out of that original class that I had talked about with the methodology class, that we now have a Worcester Digital History program, and it's an internship program for our students, and they take the coursework in the summertime, and it's a combination of working here in special collections, working at our Worcester's library genealogy department downtown with the local community. It's also working with the Worcester Historical Society, and it's going out and gathering voices and having these various exhibits. Certainly during 2020, one of the exhibits that we decided to work on, and everything had to be done remotely, was to look at what was available remotely, what we could add to the scholarship remotely. Is we did comparisons of the Spanish flu in Wayne County and to the pandemic, and they made an exhibit out of that. That'll be they're actually hoping to launch their new website in August of this year. And this summer we decided to focus on diverse voices. So we are looking at diverse voices in our own community. A lot of our students are learning how to do oral histories and to put those digitally, make them digitally available. So I think it is a way, to reach out, not just academically to learn the research there, but also to reach out to the local community and have them invested in projects as well. And that has worked very well at Worcester.
Fantastic. We're just about out of time. I love these talks, and one of the things that I liked most about them is that they demonstrate what we can do together when we work collaboratively on projects that no single individual could take on, and also when we work over a period of time. Both of the projects, I was interested in Kathy's, Kathy Harris extending hers to an undergraduate class after doing it to the graduate class, if I have the sequence correct. And obviously the one at College of Worcester going on for multiple years, just fantastic work. So thank you all so much. Terrific panel.